Thanks, everybody. I know that there's not enough time for us to chat, but we have a lot we still yet to have to cover. We have 2 more panels. This one will be a full-length panel, one shorter panel, dealing with the regulatory issues. And this panel is also being moderated by a Joint Center Senior Industry Fellow, Shekhar Narasimhan, who's a Senior Industry Fellow with us, a Managing Partner at Beekman Advisors, a former, he's the Chairman of Papillion Capital, focused on sustainable infrastructure investing, co-founder of Emergent Institute in Bangalore, India. Shekhar does it all. Shekhar was made a fellow, I believe, by Eric Belsky, my predecessor. And Eric, when he left, he said, find a way to engage with Shekhar. He is a wise person. And I think I've always been amazed by how much Shekhar, who comes from a housing finance, multifamily finance background, knows about housing policy, knows about building codes, knows about innovation and construction, and so really brings a lot to the table. And so really very pleased to have Shekhar here to lead this next conversation. So Shekhar, come on up and get us going.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. The whole idea of this half-day session was to stimulate you to start thinking about whether or not some of the ideas and thoughts and experiments can be scaled. So if you keep hearing that question, as Frank did, which is this realistic? Should we be skeptical or cynical? Well, first and foremost, I'm going to use a prism that Brian created when he spoke in the very first panel. He said that there are 3 costs associated with doing a building. He said politics, approvals, and construction. I noticed that he put politics first. And what he meant, I think, by politics was building codes, regulations, zoning, entitlements. Approvals was community and the neighborhood and the issue of NIMBYism and whether or not there's buildable land and whether there's environmental issues and all the other things that can happen that can make it either longer or not possible to build. And the final is the actual hard cost of construction. And we've spent a lot of time in the last panel on that hard cost. But it's sort of 1/3 of the reason there are 1,999,999 million reasons other than that why it won't happen or why it's so difficult to do. And our panel will, I'm first going to tell you why I used 1 million reasons it can't happen. Or why innovation has been, why we've had 1% negative productivity growth in housing, the housing industry and housing construction over basically about 100 years. The reason is that, number one, when I started to get into the whole issue of building codes, was appointed by the governor to the board in Virginia that actually oversees the building codes for the state. I found that there were 50,000 people involved with writing the code. That's a lot of people. But there actually are 50,000 people in, I don't know how many, 50,000 committees, or probably many less than that committees, that include the building code officials in America and internationally that write the International Building Code, and the Energy Efficiency Code, and the Fire Code. And it is, probably about 1 million pages long, all these things. So that's 50,000 people who look in the rearview mirror at all the problems that happen and try to figure out how to solve those problems in the future. It takes most states 3 years to adopt the prior code, and then it takes municipalities about 2 years to implement it. So in principle, you're 10 years behind when you've adopted a code. There are 950,000 people who are involved in all our jurisdictions across the United States, the 30,000 jurisdictions, in planning, zoning, entitlement, and inspections. So if you add those 2 numbers up, that's 1 million people who don't fundamentally all get in a room and scream, let's disrupt the system so we don't have anything to do tomorrow. Now, does that make it impossible? Hell no. That's the kind of challenge that our panel likes to take on. So let me introduce you to them and ask, we are going to not use slides. We're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to have a conversation with you. And then we're going to do a poll, and then we're going to ask you to, again, talk for a few minutes if we have the time and they give us the luxury of time. So first and foremost, Jesse Kanson-Benanav, he's the chair of A Better Cambridge. He's got other things he does in his life, but at least he's local, and the thing that he's focused on is the whole YIMBY movement, the issue of how do you overcome, not just overcome, but make housing and affordable housing a positive in communities. And that's a rather important piece of that approvals, piece of the cost. Adhi Nagraj is from San Francisco. He's the director of SPUR, but he's also the former director of development for Bridge. And importantly, he chairs the Oakland Planning Commission and his design review committee. So he's one, Adhi, of the 950,000. And then Harriet Tregoning. And Harriet's worked in a whole bunch of really critical roles at HUD, the District of Columbia, in Maryland. But she turns out that she's quite an innovator. And so she has more than a few ideas about how do you actually address and change things. And I don't know, Harriet, whether you got that when you were a Loeb Scholar. Should we give credit to this institution? Absolutely. But if you listen to this group, and we're going to do it by question Q&A, and then you can jump in as well, I think you're going to start to get what are the stories they've got that might scale, so that actually we can start to address this problem more substantially. So come on up and let's get started. So Harriet, since you're sitting furthest away from me, so you get to go first. There's a lot of conversations in housing, particularly when you're in an academic environment, about demography. Changes that are occurring, aging of the population, immigration, how it's affecting rental demand, et cetera. And also, of course, we've heard a lot about technology, smart homes, the effect that it might have on building materials, construction, et cetera. What do you see as some of the changes over the next 10 years that can affect housing demand?
Well, we've heard a little bit of it touched on in the conversations that have happened, and you're also touching on it. So people were talking about the fact that households are smaller. They're, in most places in the country, 30 to 50% smaller than they were in 1950, when a lot of our zoning codes kind of concretized whatever the rules were. So that's kind of one of the issues. People are living longer as adults, and a lot of our households are single-person households. I think the number for the nation is something like 26 or 27%, but in a lot of our cities where the housing demand is the highest, that number might approach the mid-40s, right? So it's a lot, and in many cities, we got some questions earlier about single-family housing versus multifamily. Most cities that have a housing shortage also have a big mismatch between the size of the units and the demographics that we're beginning to experience. So you mentioned immigration. Most of the increase in birth rate that's occurred since 1970 in the U.S. has been a function of foreign-born mothers, right? So if trends that are underway right now to really slow and stop immigration, a lot of our problems are going to be greatly exacerbated in terms of labor, right? The workforce, and the fact that we have that pyramid of aging baby boomers. By 2019, the millennials will be larger than the baby boomer generation, not because the baby boomers are dying off in droves, but because a lot of the people who have immigrated will be in that demographic here. So millennials have some different preferences, and we also had a little bit of discussion about that, right? About it's not that they don't want to have a home, but it is true that they live more with their parents than with in any other formulation, right? More than with a romantic partner, more than in some other kind of group home. They're also part of a trend to more multi-generational families kind of living together. So a lot of that suggests not only does our housing stock not necessarily match, but that there might be flexibility, a desire for flexibility in how our accumulation of housing arrangements, how they might change. Maybe a little later on we can talk also about some other technology, but I'll just throw one thing out right now, and that's the nature of work. How many people who here work at least some part of the time from home? I know we have a lot of students. So this is totally different than what it used to be, and that nationally 7% of workers telecommute, 40% want to. That means what you thought of as a residential neighborhood, a single-use neighborhood, is now invisibly a multi-use neighborhood because people are working from home, they're at home, they'd like some services at home, they'd like to be able to get coffee or go to a restaurant. So all of these things might mean that a building that might be accessory, as James Shen was talking about, to your main house is an office for part of the time. It's where your adult children come back to live after college. It's where your parents live when they get to be elderly. It's where you live when you get to be elderly. And maybe you supplement your income by renting the larger house to a family, right? So this idea about housing is also something that we might start to want to think about differently because of all of these changes, not just in demographics, but in a bunch of other areas.
Comments? Jesse? Adhi?
Go ahead.
You go.
Well, do you want me to respond to her specifically, or?
Sure.
Yeah, I think I also recently read a stat that there are fewer people per household than we used to have.
Absolutely.
And so we are much more spread out. We're creating artificial constraints on the supply. There's certainly things like Proposition 13 in California that limits the amount of assessed value that you're taxed on, which really creates an incentive for people to hold on to their homes, not sell them, because it's a great asset, especially as the rental market becomes hot. You'd much rather hold on to your home and rent it out than sell. And so it creates another artificial barrier on the churn of supply that we'd like to have in the market. So I think you're right, these kind of demographic changes with tax policy are impeding housing production and growth.
Yeah, there's sort of two things that I think about on this topic. One has to do, when I'm talking about housing production in Cambridge or Greater Boston to audiences, I often talk about my own house over near East Cambridge, mile and a half from here, which is a 2-bedroom, probably 850 square foot apartment that my wife and I and our 2 cats live in. Now, 100 years ago, when the house was built, it probably housed a family of 6 or 8 people. And it's a 2-decker, similar to the classic 3-decker here in Greater Boston. And probably one unit was owned by a working class family who could then rent out the other units in that building to help pay their mortgage or supplement their income. And because of the sort of changing nature of households, the smaller household sizes, it takes so much more housing to house the same number of people that it did 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. So just sort of using that example of my own sort of lived experience that people in the greater Boston area can relate to in terms of how they occupy their own houses has been useful. And I'll just leave it at that. There was a second point I'm escaping me right now.
I once had a Japanese banker who shall remain unnamed say to me, the reason why Americans need so much square footage per capita is because you're obese.
I'm really not going to comment on that. I'm going to stick with household size.
The household size, not the people size. So Adhi, given that all politics are local, what are some of your lessons that you've learned from zoning battles and mandates? And sort of, you've been on both sides of this. You've been a developer, you're now chair of the Planning Commission in Oakland. I assume you're going to approve no parking for this young man over here.
Are we on Twitter or no?
Yeah.
So what's worked for you on both sides of this equation and what hasn't worked?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Adhi Nagraj, live in the Bay Area. I grew up in Brookline, so I'm excited to be back home. And yeah, I will say that when you're on Twitter during a speech, you do scrub your sarcasm because who knows what's going to end up on there. I think it's important to, given the, I'm going to call it pro-growth and pro-business and let's build, 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 I want to offer what the other large percent of people are thinking because we have to be sensitive to that in order to be successful. And our supply, let's get it out there, is important, and I believe in it. And there are often legitimate concerns from communities. There is sometimes super ugly design that comes to a planning commission, and there are public officials who say, hey, a deal will come and go, but this building lives forever, and it's got to be really attractive. So there are some important push and pulls that we have, and I would say that I disagree even with my kind of pro-development folks on how much push and pull is appropriate during the process. But certainly in the Bay Area, the context is really stark. That the latest stats that I saw, a home in San Francisco, average home sales price is $1.5 million. Over the last 6 years, there's been a net increase of population of 60,000 people. And the last Bay Area population that I read was from 2016, where we grew by a net of 90,000 people. So people are flooding the Bay, jobs are flooding the Bay, and I think there are two major existential questions that we're dealing with. One is, what is the right role of the state in regulating housing and housing production? Is housing in San Francisco a San Francisco decision, or is it a Sacramento decision? And the second major existential crisis, which a lot of you I'm sure can relate to, is what right do the people who have already moved to a neighborhood, what right do they have to allow or disallow new people to come to that neighborhood? And that is the crux of every planning commission fight. There was actually the gentleman showing slides from overseas, talked about how we had to scale back the windows so that the neighbor could have sun and air. And you have to think, is that right? Is that the right system, that because someone is there first, they then get to regulate the airspace around them? And those are kind of the large questions. So how does that play out? Senator Scott Wiener, our rock star state senator, is trying to push through, and it's getting downscaled, Senate Bill 827, which basically mandates that if you're near transit, which has had a liberal definition, which is getting more constrained, then then there's no zoning that can go below either 55 feet or 85 feet. And that, I think it's a great legislation. I think he's acknowledging that a lot of cities and city council members and mayors, there's often just political downside in a lot of the neighborhoods to approving housing. And so because of that, a lot of them are not doing it, Oakland as an exception. And Patrick Kennedy's group and Randy's group have brought applications to us. And a lot of them are kind of in the downtown Lake Merritt core in Oakland. But in the neighborhoods, it's really hard to build housing. So what Scott has done is saying, hey, we're going to mandate this from Sacramento, that you've got to do it. And I feel like we need that level of a distant hammer to tell us what to do, because no right-minded politician, frankly, is going to say, all right, we're going to upzone our neighborhood, and sorry, guys, there's going to be more traffic, and there are going to be other kids going to the schools where your kids go to. So unfortunately, the political pressures are what they are, that Scott's bill is kind of coming off of its aggressive stance. Two is the Bay Area does a fair amount of area planning. So in Oakland, we'll take 40 square miles and say, hey, community, how should we reimagine this area? And let's create some parameters, FARs, design standards, minimum parking ratios, although in Oakland, a lot of it is now 0. You don't need to build parking in much of the city. And let's kind of pre-approve a building type. And then if you come in this pre-approved type, then you can go it through as of right. That plan has to go through the CEQA process, California Environmental Quality Act process, which is super laborious and way disproportionate to the amount of environmental review that other states mandate. And Washington loves its trees and owls as much as we do, and they have a much less stringent CEQA process. And what is challenging is that projects will often go through, you'll spend 3 years on an area plan, it'll cost $850,000 with all your consultants, do the environmental approvals. Project will come in, but will need like a conditional use permit for a restaurant or a liquor store, something on the ground floor. And all of a sudden, they then need to go back to get discretionary approvals. And then we're kind of relitigating the merits of that plan all over again. So it's been hard, and the same thing happens in San Francisco in the Eastern Neighborhoods Plan. So in theory, does that mean my time is up, or is someone's phone on?
No, that's just a cell phone.
So if someone could shut that off, that'd be great. So in theory, it's a great process, but when you get down to the brass tacks of providing certainty to developers, it gets really hard. Two more things quickly. One is that development, the founder of Bridge would say that development is like the Christmas tree ornaments, where you put so many ornaments on it that it falls over. Given in California and here as well, the green standards, the workforce standards, development, and especially affordable housing development, which is what I did in my career, it is being asked to solve all problems, and that is driving up dramatically the cost of housing. And we need to look at housing more as a production tool, not as we're going to help solve all these social problems as well. Last point I'll say is that in the Bay, we have a very fractured kind of geographic system. We have something like 27 transit agencies, 9 counties in the Bay, multiple cities, and each one has their own rules. And if literally like drawing a BART line from one part of town to another that goes through a few different cities takes a lot of coordination. And there are no strong regional governmental bodies that, kind of like what Scott's doing in Sacramento, say, hey guys, this is how it's going to be. We know there's going to be some local negative impact, but this is what's best for the region. And we're really suffering from that fragmentation.
Thank you, Adhi. Jesse, there is a YIMBY movement, and you've become a leader in it.
For better or for worse?
For better or for worse. So I'm curious how that happened.
Yeah.
And number two, just in terms of what Adhi is saying, where are you finding the balance between what a community wants in terms of an increase in development versus what is absolutely needed by the marketplace? I mean, where's the push and pull, and how are you dealing with it in this movement?
Well, there's a lot in that question, and we don't have it solved. I don't think we're even necessarily half of the way there. This YIMBY movement has been a real fascinating sort of organic growth. My organization, A Better Cambridge, started here in Cambridge in 2012. We were sort of functioning in this own little world, and I'll talk in a moment about how we came to be. But we were functioning in our own little ecosystem of Cambridge, pushing for more housing. And I'll talk also about why we believe in that. But over the subsequent years, really getting into 2016, is when we realized that there was similar resident organizations, resident groups around the country, places like the Bay Area, Washington, D.C., LA, Austin, Texas, many of these high-cost cities that have not actually seen as much housing growth, keeping up with population growth. That these organizations sort of organically developed with similar philosophies, doing similar things around the same time. And I think it just goes to show how sort of widespread the housing affordability crisis is. So my organization started Better Cambridge. We started in 2012. It was sort of my own personal struggle with what I witnessed having lived in Cambridge for a number of years. I come from an urban planning, affordable housing background. I believe that Cambridge is a progressive city that wants to welcome people of all backgrounds into the community. But I felt like, and I was not deeply engaged in housing and development conversations for a number of years, but I paid attention to what was going on around me. Whenever there was a new housing development proposed, whether it was 100% affordable or it was a mixed income development, there was always a strong reaction against new housing and against the impact that having new people live in our community would have. And that didn't really jive with the way that I perceived Cambridge as a progressive and welcoming community. But there's a lot of barriers it takes to get involved in some of the regulatory framework around zoning and development. It takes multiple evening meetings, sometimes city council committees that are dealing with zoning may meet during the workday, and it's really hard to get involved. So I didn't for a number of years. The summer of 2012 was really the straw that broke the camel's back for me. There was a group of residents. We have in Massachusetts a citizen zoning petition. If you have, I believe, 10 registered voters in the city, you can propose a zoning bylaw and force the municipality to consider it. A group of residents in Central Square, Cambridge, that actually proposed to downzone Central Square. And that seemed to me like the exact wrong direction we needed to take Cambridge, and in particular Central Square, which is sort of the core of Cambridge, the residential, diverse urban core. It's not the Kendall Square Biotech. It's not the Harvard Square University area. It's where the people live, and we needed more people to live there on top of the red lines. So, I started showing up at community meetings. There was a parallel planning process that was going on at the time, just expressing my displeasure with the proposed downzoning. Sometimes I was the only person that was speaking against it, but people would come up to me, other Cambridge residents would come up to me afterwards and say, Jesse, I really liked what you said, and I feel the same way. I didn't feel like I knew how to say it, or even worse, I didn't feel comfortable saying it because there was a lot of bad blood that was starting to emerge. But it quickly became clear to me that there was more residents around the city that actually sort of believed in my philosophy, that creating higher density, multifamily, mixed-use communities in Central Square is the best way to address the racial segregation, racism, and environmental destruction that was wrought by 70, 80 years of suburban sprawl in this country. So we just started organizing, not even with the intention of being a long-standing community group, but organizing against the downzoning. We stood up with multiple people at city council or planning board hearings to speak against it. We met with members of the city council to say why we were opposed to this and why this doesn't actually reflect Cambridge's progressive values to make it harder for people to live in Cambridge. And we were actually successful in convincing the city council not to move forward with that downzoning petition. So that's where we came from. That was back in 2012. We've taken a number of other battles over the last few years. Like I said a minute ago, it's difficult for residents often, or for a broad and diverse group of residents to engage in these kind of conversations when you have to show up to multiple meetings after work or during the workday. Many of our members are young people with young families, children. They don't have the luxury of being able to show up. And so many of our planning processes are then reflecting the desires of some of the more entrenched communities with the resources to engage in those rather intensive regulatory processes. So we're trying to move the conversation forward. We're trying to have a sort of future forward-thinking approach, saying we don't just plan for what the current residents in Cambridge right now, but we need to think about the future. We need to think about the fact that people are moving to Cambridge, and we have not kept up housing production with population growth. The people who are moving to Cambridge often have higher incomes and can outbid the current residents for housing. And so we need to actually create new housing, not just affordable housing, but we need to create the market and even some of the high-end housing in order to help buffer existing residents who are more lower or middle income from having to compete with those higher income folks. So that's a lot that I just said, but that's sort of where we came from.
Allison.
Sure, and certainly some passion.
Yeah.
Harriet,
So,
comment?
I think that it's funny, we've all kind of worked in planning and affordable housing and kind of advocacy to some degree, and I kind of blame us, all right? Because we have to public officials have to manage the expectations of communities, and how did anybody get the expectation that because they bought a house, they have the right, to control the property across the street and down the street and 3 blocks away, and they get to stop people from doing things, even if they suggest it might affect their property value, they're almost always wrong, right? That it will go down, but that somehow that's a property right they have, which it isn't. Right. So I feel like part of what we need to do, is raise the stakes, because it's not just can people afford to live here? It's are we still America, the place where you can, however humble your beginnings, rise to the highest positions. We are not. There's more of the American dream alive in Canada, according to Raj Chetty, than in America. And part of that reason is, I think, is represented in one way in the Bay Area, that the growth of the GDP in this country, people used to move to places of opportunity where they could better their lives for themselves and their families, but you can't get in to these areas anymore because they're too expensive because we constrained the housing supply. So that economic mobility is gone, and the income, so the only people who get to be there are the people who are already pretty wealthy, right? And so we have these huge disparities, and there's no way for the people who are at the bottom to catch up. And so, I feel like we have an obligation to say, this is true in our community, but it's true in our country. And we are dooming generations of future Americans to a much worse life, and all of the rest of us to a more conflict-ridden, unfair society if we don't fix this.
And
Got
totally
it,
agree.
perfect.
That was wonderful. Man, now what I'm going to say is going to sound so inarticulate compared to that.
So,
but I will
Adhi,
try.
one minute, and then we'll wrap up.
I am, after Scott's SB 827, I started rereading The Color of Law, the book that came out last year from the Berkeley prof. And I read a page last night that Brookline, where I grew up in the late 1800s, forbade sale of your homes. It was restricted covenant to any black person or any Irish person. And it reminded me how, the author writes about this in the beginning, zoning was really used as a tool to keep African Americans out, to keep poor people away.
Keep Jews out.
To keep Jews out. It was a very restrictive tool. And what is really frustrating now is that attempts to upzone and to allow housing is being co-opted as a way to have a big windfall to developers, and they're just going to make money. You're going to sanitize the community. But it really, and I think we need to do a better job of saying it is a tool to right the wrongs of 100 years ago. And there are articles in local papers around the Bay Area kind of lauding how we're looking to downzone from the early 1900s in order to keep certain people out. So I think we also need to tell that story. It's great that you're doing that. And I think what we in the Bay need are city council members and supervisors who are willing to hear the 15 people upset that a 2-story is going to become a 4-story, but say, you know what, that's important for the neighborhood. I've seen it twice. There was an Oakland City Council member. Temescal is one of the neighborhoods where Randy's building, and it's kind of a 20 to 40-foot building area. And Boston Properties proposed and got approved because of a lot of YIMBY turnout for 22 stories, and it's right at a transit center. That city council member, who was a month away from a re-election vote, kind of had the courage to say, we need a lot more housing in our community. And yes, this is going to be a lot taller, but we need a lot more housing. In the Excelsior district in San Francisco, my last job was a 400-unit, affordable market, new grocery store. And this project right now is going to be out of context physically from where the neighborhood is. But in 5 and 10 years, it's the future of where the neighborhood is going. It's right near a BART stop. And he said, he's actually a MIT guy, sorry. Sorry. He's a Cambridge guy. He's trying to tell us, he's taken some hits, but he's standing tall and saying, we've got to do this. So we need to also figure out how do we get those leaders in positions who are willing to take some heat for what they think is the right thing to do.
And that requires not just standing up at hearings, but supporting those politicians who are courageous enough to do that.
Yes.
We're going to take the conversation break, but we're going to put up the poll question. And if we can do that, and you can tweet your response, or text your response, rather. And maybe we'll join the tables and come back here in 10 minutes.
Sure.
But I want you to leave you with an image. There's a fantastic picture of Zuckerberg testifying before the Senate Committee on Commerce. And in that picture, which I don't have up, unfortunately, there's this body of cameras that are following him. So you can't actually see a single senator. And he's just sort of looking straight ahead. My vision was Zuckerberg at every zoning hearing from now on advocating for more housing.
Yeah.
So please respond to the question, 10 minutes maximum, and we'll come back and wrap up here. Thank you. I hope you were talking about regulations, politics, and policy. It sounded very animated.
How are you? Good to see you too.
So we've got a few minutes that we're going to chat, and then we're going to open it up and let you ask us questions or make comments, and then we need to wrap in 20 minutes, I was told. So we'll get our caution notices in white here. So let me start with you, Harriet. what are the things, and if you can keep it to one or two, that you would change that would really fundamentally move the needle and scale this issue of production? What we're seeing here is, if you could do what they're talking about in California, right? The state Senate bill. If that bill passed and you expanded the as of right development, so the processes to get entitlement and approvals was substantially reduced. You're not compromising safety and security, and you're not talking to the neighbors, but you're giving some authority and some mandates that provide clarity. That's, I think, what the response was. But what would you do? Is that what you would do? Would you legislate it?
So I did update our zoning code from 1958 when I was the head of planning with the District of Columbia. And it was a many years process to get it done, but we reduced parking requirements, eliminated them in many places, and we allowed accessory dwelling units by right. But we already had a relatively permissive by right system. So if you built what was zoned, you didn't need a discretionary approval. That doesn't prevent some neighborhoods from still going nuts. But I think that's a very important thing that you have by right. But actually what's happening in California are two things. That's a state preemption that's happening in California. So we're in Massachusetts, but these are really the only two states in the country who have taken a historical interest in housing. So you have 40B, you have other things that you're thinking about doing here in Massachusetts, but even though the Constitution would give states typically the ability to do this, almost no state is doing it for housing, and particularly not for affordable housing. And, if they're using their preemption, they're using it to, in some cases, to hurt cities, right, not to help them. So I would call out preemption as, if you have a benign place, that could be helpful, because it's really hard for local politicians to do this. They love to hear the federal government say it too. Somebody else made me do it. I hate it too. I'm going to hold my nose and let it happen. That's what people need.
Adhi, what would you add?
Yeah, the two things. One is, God, California is such a fascinating place right now, because it is, the conjured image of the suburban dream with beautiful beaches, and then the flood of a ton of people coming and wanting to be there. And in many ways, the state is having like an identity crisis of who are we? And it would be super helpful. A way that I have thought about kind of threading the needle between what Scott has wanted to do, what's getting beaten down, is to give jurisdictions a housing requirement of they need to build X number of units within Y number of years. And if you don't do it, so we're going to give you one last shot, guys. We know you've got the RENA system, but it has really no teeth. So we're going to give you one last shot. If you don't build it within X number of years, then all of these state sticks are going to get imposed upon you. I also think our tax system in California makes it very attractive for cities to build office developments and unattractive for them to build housing. Housing is expensive from a municipal perspective. Cops, schools, police, and cops. And office is cheap, and retail is cheap, and the cities actually retain a lot of the tax value. And so if we need to come up with a tax system that actually incentivizes what we want to build, which is a lot more residential housing. So cities get to retain a lot of the property taxes that would otherwise go to Sacramento. If we just make it more financially lucrative for cities to build housing, the horrible examples in the Bay of Cupertino that built the Apple spaceship but no residential housing, Brisbane that eliminated all residential housing from a large development plan. If we change the incentives that they're attracted to do it, plus having this kind of stick approach, then I feel like whether or not sometimes it is that these guys and gals want cover, and sometimes they're just true NIMBYs and don't want things to change, and it'll force them to change.
Jesse?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true what Harriet said. Massachusetts has been a leader in the United States on housing. To pass Chapter 40B in 1969 was an incredibly progressive thing. But we're also at a point where a lot of these communities, suburban communities, are working real hard just to get to their 10% so that they don't actually have to do any more affordable housing. They want to build affordable housing so that they don't have to build any more affordable housing. Sort of parallel to that is the fact that we have although we have the state 40B law, we have these tiny, tiny jurisdictions. Somerville is 4.5 square miles. Cambridge is 7 square miles. Most of these urban core towns are really small, and they're making their own planning decisions for their own benefit or agenda that impacts the entire region, but they're not thinking regionally. We don't have county government. We don't really have any way to think regionally in Massachusetts, but we have a regional housing crisis. I do spend a lot of time fighting for more housing and more affordable housing here in Cambridge, but I recognize that Cambridge alone can't do it. We need all of these communities to step up. So we need to think about ways to get the communities to work together. I know the Metropolitan Area Planning Council has convened mayors from cities around Metro Boston to talk about how can they address the affordable housing crisis. I would like to see more rule of law behind it. I don't know if it's threatening municipalities' transportation funding if they have fixed rail or fixed route transit but don't build housing. Something like that would be a real interesting way to try to move the needle forward in some of these suburban communities. We within the YIMBY movement, and I like to see, I guess it's not up there anymore, that one of the desired approaches, it was one of the popular ones. We're trying to build out a regional network of YIMBY organizations. We have about 10 communities represented that either have existing groups or fledgling organizations. My friend Jared Johnson, I think, is here somewhere in the audience, who represents some pro-housing activists in Dorchester. We have folks in Malden and Newton. We really need to figure out how to empower residents across the community to push their regulators to think on a regional level. So there's a lot of challenges to that, but that's what we need to do.
Excellent.
Sorry, just one quick additional thing is we also need to be mindful in zoning, and I think there are more opportunities to be mindful of construction type and what construction type you could actually build to house people of middle incomes. It's the 60% in the Bay, it's the 60 to 120% AMIs that are getting hit. And so, if you look at type 5 construction, kind of just a pure wood frame construction where the returns don't need to be that great in order to build the construction because it's so cheap, or let's say 3 or 4, 5 stories of type 3 over a 2-story podium. A lot of the planning that we're seeing is really type 1 buildings, super expensive, but for the oncoming modular revolution, it's really expensive. So you need to charge super high rents to meet your return, to pay your debt, and it is exacerbating the middle income that's not getting served. And so if we're mindful, especially in the neighborhoods, of the 4, 5, 6-story zoning, so it's a different product type, cheaper materials, often non-union. The union folks don't really do that kind of product in the Bay. Costs are cheaper. You can rent at a lower level, meet your returns, and house a middle-income population without a subsidy.
I'm going to just throw out one provocative idea because you look like you could use being provoked. So we're talking a lot about housing, but the two biggest expenses for any household are housing and transportation. And we've talked about the parking interaction between housing and transportation. I just did a kind of a week-long engagement in Columbus where they really wanted to help a low and moderate income neighborhood that they expected to be kind of a place where development was going to begin to turn. And they wanted to encourage and retain the affordable housing. They had very good intentions. I said, what's the rate of household car ownership? They're like, don't know. I looked real quick. Columbus has the highest rate of car ownership in the entire, of any city in Ohio. They have bus transit but no fixed skyway. They're proud of that because they would like to leap to the next technology. They'd like to really look at autonomous and on-demand car sharing and all of that. So great. Yet they're zoning in this neighborhood where they're worried about affordability. Every dwelling unit had to have 2 off-street parking spaces, and 36% of households in this neighborhood didn't own even a single car. So my point is, if you're a city that's innovating, let's look at where you're not innovating. If your zoning is still forcing people to create assets that are going to be obsolete, like structured parking, right, or increase the cost of housing for no good reason, then you're not innovating. It's not going to be innovative. We have 7 to 9 parking spaces for each and every car in America right now. Millennials are not driving so much because they're smart. and they don't like the value proposition.
Yeah.
They don't like this value proposition. Cars are driven 5% of the time in the US and parked 95% of the time.
Yeah.
They want to pay for the car when they use a car. What a novel idea,
Yeah.
right? So it's part of that is changing transportation. Think about 30% of every city is roads and parking. 30% of the land is roads and parking. What if we made that land progressively available for housing or to manage climate change and stormwater? I'm just saying that there are opportunities that are headed our way that we could be innovating around. You know, already in some airports in San Francisco and others, 50% of the parking revenue is down because people are using ride hailing. You know, what are some alternate uses for parking? I'd love to park one of your projects on wheels, you know, on the top floor of a parking garage at the airport. I would love to live there. You know, like, are there different ways to think about how literally communities could be mobile, but as communities, you can build a mobile home and you don't need to pass the building code in a local place. DOT tells you what it is. If you made it cool, it could be a thing.
And the unique way that the affordable housing industry is problematic is, you know, you have your hard costs, you get an eligible basis based on your eligible hard cost, and you can go leverage tax credits based on your eligible basis. Parking is an eligible cost, and so to take Michael's $60K per, if you're building a 100-unit building, you're doing 20 parking spaces, that's $1.2 million just on parking. But you get, it's eligible basis, so you get tax credit equity to do that. I then started thinking, God, what if you took that $1.2 million, do no parking, but you capitalize an account in the partnership that owns that building of $1.2 million, and tenants can, you know, draw down on that account over time for Lyft and Uber for years. That probably would last you decades. And then you're not building extra parking. Now, the tax credit system does not treat that $1.2 million capitalized account as basis eligible. So you're actually not incentivized to do that. So I think, given that Harry knows everyone in DC, that's like a very discrete way that at least the affordable industry, super stodgy, could be incentivized to build less parking and to provide this endless account of flexible transit money.
Very interesting idea, and it ties to finance. The National Multi-Housing Council did a study in which they said there's 85 million square feet of excess parking space already in commercial buildings in the United States. And 10 years from now, you know, theoretically, we should be working with every zoning planning commission, every design architect to say, how does that space get used to create more housing?
Redesign the park.
Yeah. Redesign the park. See, there's a challenge for all the millennials here. I'm going to open it up. We can keep talking here probably till the cows come home to moo or something. But any questions, comments, thoughts? How about from the way back over there? Anybody?
There's a woman here.
Yes. She'll get you a microphone.
Hi, I have a question that is something I've brought up in plenty of public meetings, and that is, are you building homes or are you building warehouses for people? Because when I ask a developer in Cambridge what they expect their turnover in all the rental housing, the big buildings that they're building, is going to be, they tell me 50 to 100% a year. That's the uniform answer. That's not building homes for people. It's not building community. And I think that, that the people who oppose a lot of these developments are opposing it because they aren't getting neighbors. What they're getting is a gated community dumped in their neighborhood. They're getting what amounts to an extended stay motel. And if we want, I mean, the basis for resiliency is community. And if you don't know anybody because they're only there for 6 months, you're not answering any of the real problems that have been talked about today. You're just building warehouses.
Yeah. Jesse?
Well, thank you, Ms. Hoffman, for your question. She and I have had some disagreements in Cambridge over the years, but I appreciate.
Why did I think that?
I appreciate. Certainly.
I understand.
I
And your point is
don't
well
disagree
made.
with that. The areas of agreement that we've certainly had are on the creation of 100% affordable housing developments, which are critical, these tax credit properties, developments. So I'm glad that we've been able to work together to support some of those. The fact is, people are coming to Cambridge, whether we like it or not. They're coming here for, short, fellowships in our institutions. Maybe they're doing a couple months in one of the biotech companies. There is actually a market for these developments, and it may be 50 to 100% turnover, but frankly, if we're not building new developments that's giving those people an opportunity to come here, they're going to compete with you and me. We've already lost such a large proportion of the sort of naturally occurring affordable housing stock in the existing wood frame triple deckers because we haven't built enough over the last decade or two here in Cambridge. So not building that type of housing will actually just exacerbate displacement. It'll cause the lower and middle income folks in Cambridge who can't bid up the price of housing to have to find housing in the further suburbs and not be able to benefit from the great amenities, access to jobs, schools, transportation that we have here in Cambridge. So I think Heather and I have a philosophical disagreement at times, but the fact is the population in Cambridge is on track to surpass peak population. That's with smaller family sizes, it's with people of higher incomes, and we have the freedom of movement in this country. We can't put up a gate and tell people that they can't come into Cambridge.
Yes.
Good question, good response. Did you have a question, comment?
Yeah, I do.
Coming.
One of the questions that we got earlier on Twitter that I think is relevant to this session is for city planners working on a comprehensive plan. What would you suggest? And I know there's a lot, but top few priorities to a city planner working on a comprehensive plan.
As much by right development as possible,
Yes.
inclusionary zoning. I wrote an autonomous vehicle element last summer just for fun for our city's comprehensive plan because that's also going to be an issue. No one is yet, they're all gee whiz on technology. No one's paying attention to land use, right? How land use might need to change, what might happen to employment. So I think that would be a great thing to be working on. And I think we're all kind of familiar what's happening in Boston. A little more on resilience and climate change would also be really awesome.
Adhi?
I want to pick on one thing, and that's inclusionary, and that's because it's a huge debate. I mean, in San Francisco, I think the average city subsidy per affordable unit is about $300,000. So 10 units of affordable is $3 million, 100 is 30. Like, you scale up super quickly. There's no way that the city can subsidize its way out of this problem. So we do need to have more partnerships with the market rate sector. What those partnerships are super problematic in that I have not seen kind of a healthy conversation. I feel like in San Francisco, we just went through this inclusionary zoning challenge where a supervisor put on the ballot that every project had to have 30% inclusionary. Development applications just stopped to the planning department. There then was this work where this technical committee started saying, hey, how much can a market rate developer, given these kind of assumed metrics, which is so hard because they change every day, interest rates, equity requirements, cost of capital.
Density bonus?
Density bonus.
Well, this was just without the density bonus, just like a template, what would a typical project be able to afford? Because the density bonus takes you out of the inclusionary obligation in the city. So this was just like a 100-unit building, what could a developer afford? And that number was like between 14 and 18%. And that went to the Board of Supervisors, and the SUP said, we're going to go with 18, and it's going to tick up 1% per year. And so once again, it's just totally divorced from the economics. And we need to have better inclusionary. It's just something that I haven't seen any jurisdiction do well. I feel like there are developers who feel like, God, those guys don't know the risk that I'm going through every day. Community members feel like these developers are hiding something from me. And then politicians often will aim high and aim too high and stop feasibility. So inclusionary has been mentioned a few times, and the public subsidy has been mentioned a few times. It's a high number, and so we need to come up with better ways to have those conversations.
Jesse?
I
Quick.
was also going to say inclusionary zoning. We did increase, and we supported an increase in inclusionary zoning in Cambridge to 20%. Unfortunately, there was no additional density bonus that was added on top of that. We also, aside from the density bonus, did not give any exemption from any of the dimensional requirements. So developers are finding, based on some of the conversations that I've had, it's difficult to do inclusionary developments when you still have to build as many cars, you can't build as tall, you have to have as much open space. And so we need to make inclusionary zoning work. We can't just do inclusionary zoning because we want it. It has to actually move the needle forward and build the housing.
So I'm going to wrap it with a somewhat radical suggestion.
Nice.
Right after Katrina, the city of New Orleans didn't have a planning department, didn't have a police force, didn't have many people. They went and instituted something using the emergency provisions under Louisiana law that they called a housing emergency, which, by the way, I think if you have 10 cities in Irvine, you have a housing emergency. And in the housing emergency, they essentially, because they didn't have any building code department, didn't have any inspectors, they went to what they call rule-based construction, which meant that you had to meet minimum health and safety standards, certified to it, hire people to come and certify to it, but you could build it, and you could basically get your plans approved in 24 hours. They have rebuilt New Orleans cheaper, faster, and there's a lot of issues about whether it was done right and whether all the same people could come back. And I understand all those other political or racial issues. But if you just took a prism of, is it possible in an emergency in a city for a city mayor to have the guts to say, I have a housing emergency. I therefore have to amend some of the ways that people say, I've already got mine. I don't need any more. I was in Irvine a week ago, and there was a demonstration by very wealthy people against the tent cities, asking that people be moved out because they didn't want to see them. And all I'm saying is that if we don't fundamentally change the attitudinal frame and decide that there is, in fact, an emergency in the housing system, and it isn't just about innovation, but it's about affordability, we can't actually solve the problem because the current system, and there's still 1 million reasons why we won't be able to do it. But you've been a fantastic panel, Harriet, Adhi, Jesse. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, enjoyed it.